This week, the subject of our shiur was Shabtai Tzvi, the great debacle, the great tragedy, and the man who was most outspoken against him, Rabbi Glatstein. And I was thinking, there have been many false Mashiachs in the history of the Jewish people, whether it was Bar Kochva, Jacob Frank, Nehemiah Chiyun. There have been many Mashiachei Sheker. And this is a great tragedy in the history of the Jewish people, because the aftermath of the false Messiah is unfortunately conversion, assimilation, disillusionment, massacre. It's one of the great tragedies of Jewish history. And momentarily we'll see, Rabbi Glatstein considers it one of the main tragedies throughout the history of the Jewish people. So I was wondering, why don't we commemorate this tragedy on any particular fast day? We know many Gedolim taught us that we don't commemorate the Holocaust on a specific day, rather we reserve it for Tisha B'Av. But what about the false Mashiach? What is the proper day to mourn the tragedy of the Mashiachei Sheker? And it occurred to me that the answer is very simple and clear. Actually, last night we spoke about Shabtai Tzvi. So my good friend Isaac Yaselovsky said, now the reason I was speaking about it is because in preparation for the upcoming trip, we're going to Amsterdam, we're going to be at the kever of Rabbi Glatstein. But my good friend said, oh, of course you spoke about it on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz because of the Rabbi Glatstein that we learned. And then I remembered, we had learned from Rabbi Glatstein, the Kavetz Mamarim. Rabbi Glatstein says, there are two great tragedies that the Jewish people always encounter. One is from the outside and one is from within. From the outside, the blood libel. And the reason for the blood libel, it's well known. Rabbi Glatstein says it's because of the sin of Mechiras Yosef. We created the first blood libel. God says, you want a blood libel? I'll show you. But then Rabbi Glatstein reveals there's a great tragedy that occurs to the Jewish people from within, and that is the tragedy of the false Mashiach. And Rabbi Glatstein says the reason for the tragedy of the false Mashiach and everything that accompanies it, be it the assimilation, the conversion, the massacre, it's because we made the first false Mashiach. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I'll be right back on 40 days. And on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, we knew Moshe was supposed to come, but we didn't realize it was going to be a little bit later. And on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, we made the Egel Hazahav. We made the first false Mashiach. Says Rabbi Glatstein, the reason why Klal Yisrael in every generation, Rabbi Glatstein writes, has encountered the false Mashiach is because we created the Egel. We made the Egel. We made the golden calf. So it occurred to me, the Mishnah says in Tainus, 5 tragedies occurred on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. The luchos were broken, and the Tamid stopped being brought, and the Torah was burnt, and the city's walls were breached, and they put a tzelem in the Heichal. But why doesn't the Mishnah say the Chet HaEgel? The answer is the Chet HaEgel wasn't the tragedy, that was the sin that seared that this day would be a day of tragedy. And therefore, we could humbly advance that there is no day that is more designated to mourn the tragedy of the false Mashiach than the day that we committed the sin that brought about the repercussions of the false Mashiach, that brought about the possibility of Klal Yisrael in every generation having a false Mashiach. Today, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is the day that is dedicated to mourn the tragedies of Mashiachei Sheker. So it's a good thing that we spoke about last night, Shabtai Tzvi. What better day to think about this great tragedy than the day that the Chet happened, that Rabbi Glatstein says is the cause for the false Mashiachs. So perhaps today is the day designated to mourn these great tragedies. And then my good friend Rav Shmuel Batnik reminded me of a Chassam Sofer we've said over many times. Chassam Sofer makes a cheshbon that Rus came to the fields of Bayaz. The Targum says on the B'tchilas K'tzir Sa'irim. The pasuk says in Rus, Parak Aleph Pasuk Chaf Beis, B'tchilas Ktsir Sa'irim, which the Targum identifies as B'ma'alei Yom de Pesach, right before Pesach, Erev Pesach, which means she arrives on Erev Pesach, and then for 3 months she's there, Ad Kelois Ktsir HaSa'irim Ktsir HaChitim, which was 3 months, which conclude on the 15th of Tammuz. Rus then is advised by Naomi to come to Boaz and ask him to marry her, and on the night of the 16th of Tammuz, Rus follows the directive of her mother-in-law, and that night Boaz said, stay till the morning, which means on that day Boaz tells Rus that there's a closer relative, and on the morning of the 16th Rus returns to Naomi, and Naomi says, this man will not rest until he settles the matter today, on the 16th. Why on the 16th? Maybe he'll take a couple days. After all, if you're going to get married, you got to book the hall, you got to get the photographer. No, says Achsam Sofer. Because the next day was already the 17th of Tammuz. On the 17th of Tammuz, it was not a good time for the Beis Yehuda to get married. They knew it was Re'a Mazle then, and therefore if Boaz was going to marry her, he would do it on the 16th. Says Achsam Sofer, the relations that Boaz had with Rus was the night of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Oived, the progenitor of Mashiach ben David, was conceived on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. So now we see Zeh L'um Hazeh. We see that Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, on the one hand, it was the day that sowed the seeds for the possibility of the false Mashiach throughout history, but at the same time, it's the beginning of the tzmicha, of the flourishing of the true Mashiach ben David. Both capacities are latent in this day. It's the day that we sowed the seeds of Mashiach Sheker, and it's the day that is latent with the possibility of the flourishing of the Mashiach Emes. And that's why we always like to say Rebbe, who came from the Beis David. Rachatz literally means he bathed, but Rachatz, he trusted. Bekroina shel tzipori, in the glory, literally a wagon. But Bekeren, in the glory of Tzipori, the bird, Klal Yisrael, B'Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. When Rebbe looked at this day, maybe on the outside it seems like it's a day of great tragedy. It was a day seared with tragedy through the sin of the golden calf, but that just means that the Klippa was clamoring to sully the possibility for Mashiach Dafka on this day, because this day is predisposed for the flourishing of Mashiach. So therefore the Satan tried everything in his arsenal to make this day sullied with Mashiach Sheker, but we know Rebbe trusted in the real latent potential of this day to bring about Tzmichas Geula for Klal Yisrael, and therefore he was Rachatz B'Tzipori B'Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. So while we mourn the 5 great tragedies enumerated in the Mishnah and Taanis, let's not forget about many tragedies that happened throughout history because of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. And therefore remember that this must be a day latent with the potential for the tzmicha of Ben David, as in fact Oived was conceived on this day. Wishing everyone an easy fast. We should all be zaycha that Tzom Haravi yeh lebeis Yehuda l'sasayin u'lesimcha l'mayadim toivim v'ha'emes v'hashalom ehavu.